As I mentioned before the break, we're going to switch and talk about providing meals for preschoolers. Again, I do want to remind those of you that operate after school care snack programs or the special milk program, we will be talking about that after the Q&A section at the end, just because again, that is not, those two programs don't necessarily apply to all sites. But I did want to make mention of it here because in your handout packet or in your slides, depending on when you printed those might appear before the section that we're currently moving to. So just so you are aware that the order is a little bit off. So those of you that offer meals or provide meals to preschool students do have a couple of different meal patterns to choose from or to operate under, and I'll go into further detail about how you would determine which one to utilize. But of course, there is the National School Lunch Program, and then also there is the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP. And the portions for this would be based on a child's age rather than a child's grade, like it is in NSLP. So in the CACFP, portions are based on a child's age, so ages 1 to 2 and 3 to 5, rather than based off grade group or, yeah. Next slide. So how do you determine which meal pattern you should utilize? That is going to depend on when and where these preschool students or children would be eating. So you can utilize the school breakfast program and the National School Lunch Program meal patterns if those preschoolers are served in the cafeteria at the same time as other students or grade groups. So we refer to this as commingling. If students are not commingled, if those preschool students are not commingled, and perhaps those meals are served in their classroom, maybe they have like a little kitchenette and a dining area in their actual, or some tables that they utilize for meals in their actual classrooms, then you would need to adhere to the Child and Adult Care Food Program meal pattern. And that is what we will be going over in these next few slides. So if they're not commingled, you would follow this Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP for short. The good thing here is that it's based on those same required components as the school breakfast program and the school lunch program. Breakfast, there's still 3 required components, and lunch, there are 5 required components. So again, it follows some of the same patterns, but portion sizes, as we'll see, are impacted, as well as a couple other requirements. So here again, just like we saw for the lunch meal pattern and the breakfast meal pattern, we have a nice chart that summarizes what those portion sizes should be if you're following the CACFP meal pattern for these preschool students. And that is broken out by age. So you have ages 1 to 2 and ages 3 to 5. And that handout again is in your handout packet. Next slide, please. So for milk, I know we talked a lot about those transitional meal pattern standards, and we saw in the National School Lunch Program, you know, that the flavored milk could now be offered in 1%. But if you are following the CACFP meal pattern, only unflavored, either low-fat 1% or skim milk would be allowed. Flavored milk would not be eligible to be served under CACFP guidelines. So if those students are commingled, you would still follow that NSLP meal pattern. If they're not commingled, those students could not have or could not be offered flavored milk varieties. Much like regular school lunch meal pattern, water must also be offered at meals in CACFP. It cannot be served in place of milk. So again, it needs to be served alongside or offered alongside milk at those meals or snacks. Next slide, please. Oops, go back. Yep, there we go. Meat alternate options. So here again, you could offer tofu and yogurt, including soy yogurt. So we do know that some children or students may have food intolerances or allergies. So if they can't have dairy yogurt, soy yogurt could be an option. Those can both be served in CACFP. I do want to call your attention to yogurt because under these CACFP meal pattern guidelines, there is a sugar requirement or kind of a target that you must be aware of. So for a 4-ounce serving, no more than 15 grams of sugar can be in that yogurt. And there is a handout, again, in your handout packet that helps kind of give you the breakdown. So for the portion size, how many grams of sugar would be allowable. But again, for a 4-ounce or essentially a 1/2 cup serving of yogurt, it would be limited to no more than 15 grams of sugar. And then overall, those meat alternate quantities, they credit the same as they would in the school lunch meal pattern. Next slide, please. Fruits and vegetables. So these, again, are going to be considered separate meal components. Typically, we would see 1/2 cup servings of each, although in this particular meal pattern, you could serve 1 cup of vegetables, although they would have to be 2 different vegetables, and no fruit. So instead of offering a 1/2 cup of fruit and a 1/2 cup of vegetable, you could offer 2 different types of vegetables, both at a 1/2 cup each, and no fruit. And this would only apply to the CACFP meal pattern. With juice, you can offer juice, but it is limited to once per day. So it would need to be either offered, if you're going to offer it, and you do meals both at breakfast and lunch for preschool students, you could only offer it at one of those meal timeframes. Moving along to grains, at least 1 serving per day must be whole grain rich. So here again, we notice a little bit of a difference between what we see in the National School Lunch Meal Pattern and the School Breakfast Program Meal Pattern, because those are following that 80% whole grain rich requirement per week. This is stating at least 1 serving per day for these preschool students would need to be whole grain rich. Breakfast cereals, again, this is another one to kind of bring attention to, but breakfast cereals should contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per day, or excuse me, per dry ounce. And then grain-based desserts are generally not creditable in CACFP. The only exceptions would be things like maybe muffins or quick breads, and then occasional graham cracker, animal cracker. But we would want those desserts to only be served on occasion and not on a frequent basis. If you're serving snacks as a part of the CACFP meal pattern, just keep in mind snacks served during the school day would not be eligible to be claimed for reimbursement. So even though they may be non-reimbursable snacks, depending on licensing requirements, and from my understanding, if you're licensed as a preschool in the state of Nebraska, even though that snack would be non-reimbursable, you would still need to follow CACFP meal pattern guidelines for that snack. So just think about it in terms of, we want to make sure that these students are being offered the most nutrient dense options. And even if it's not a creditable meal, or snack in this instance, we still want to make sure that we're offering, you know, the most nutrient dense options, and we know that that is based around what these meal patterns show us. A few other program considerations. So record keeping, like those production records, label information. Again, we have to have those on file in order to document compliance with that meal pattern. So this falls right in line with the other two meal patterns, everything that Erica was just talking about in terms of production records and documentation. If it's not documented, unfortunately, we have to view it as, you know, that it didn't happen, even if we want to believe you, you know, that it was, that a food component was offered, it has to be documented. In terms of food production, frying as a food production method would not be allowed for this meal pattern. And then offer versus serve is also not an option when utilizing the CACFP meal pattern. So, you know, just again, keep that in mind. All items in their full amounts would need to be offered. There is the ability to serve according to family style meal service. And on the next slide, we can see some of the guidelines that would require. So obviously there needs to be adult supervision. Children would be seated at tables, but they would be allowed to serve themselves utilizing this family style meal service. Each food component would need to be there in sufficient quantity and must be available for each child to select at least the minimum required portion. And then as long as a child is offered each food component more than once, technically they could decline all foods. But again, we're going to strongly encourage that adult or those adults that are supervising are encouraging those students to take, you know, the various food components and, you know, hopefully in the right amounts that will help carry them throughout the rest of their day. All right, now kind of switching gears. So we're going to talk about a few other important topics. And I'm going to kick us off by talking about both the civil rights section as well as special diets. So for civil rights, this is something that we want all of our programs to be very aware of. Taylor, if you could move us to the next slide, please. I did want to bring your attention to the USDA non-discrimination statement. This statement must be included in all program information, and the full statement should be included in your student handbook at the end of the section that addresses the school meals programs. Do note that non-discrimination statement, and I think we'll maybe see this on a couple other slides, but that non-discrimination statement was recently modified and it had 5 words added to it. So, you know, do take note of that. The updated version is in your handout packet in the civil rights summary. And that, again, you will want to know that needs to change for anywhere that non-discrimination statement would appear in your program information or materials. On menus, so we recognize there's limited spacing on menus, so that could be that single non-discrimination sentence or statement that states USDA is an equal opportunity provider. Another requirement under civil rights is that both schools and residential child care institutions are required to provide annual training to food service staff on civil rights. And documentation of this training should also be retained on file. That documentation would need to include the name of each staff member participating, their role in the school meals program, and when they completed that training. along with, again, maybe the source of that training. And we'll talk about a couple available training options that you may utilize. Next slide. So some of those training resources are available right on our website. And we can see the second bullet point there under civil rights training. So there is a USDA civil rights training, but there's also one through the Institute of Child Nutrition. And both of those trainings would be eligible or would work to meet that requirement of civil rights training on an annual basis. Earlier, I mentioned the outline of civil rights, or that civil rights summary, and that's that top bullet point on our website. On the next slide, another requirement is also that this "And Justice for All" poster be displayed in a prominent location in the cafeteria for all to view. So as we know, that non-discrimination statement changed. I think we had just seen new "And Justice for All" posters come out within the last couple of years. There was like a backlog of them for a while. So for the time being, we want you to keep your current poster, "And Justice for All" poster, in place. And the current one that we had prior to that non-discrimination statement being changed was the one that you see on this slide with the USDA building in the background. So for the time being, until we receive notification of new "And Justice for All" posters being released, you will want to keep that one up. And then our office will obviously communicate once those are available to request that signage. Other possible locations that you might want to hang that "And Justice for All" poster might include the office where the free and reduced eligibility determinations are made, maybe the entrance to your school, and again, obviously in that cafeteria, or if there's a central kitchen where food is being prepared. Again, if you don't have a poster currently, we do have some supply of this, but just keep in mind, again, though, there will be another revision coming. So stay tuned for more communication from our office. Moving on, we also wanted to share some information about special diets. So the Americans with Disability Act, or ADA, made important changes to the meaning and interpretation of the term disability. And that definition was expanded to include anything that affects a major life activity. So these changes have made it easier for individuals to establish a disability, and most physical and mental impairments constitute a disability. So as food service staff, it is really important to be aware of the procedures for how you will need to handle dietary requests. We want food service staff to work with the households to make sure that they can best meet the nutritional needs of a student. And we'll get into some of the forms of documentation that you might receive and what would be necessary to get back from households. That said, households also must be informed of the process and procedure for how they might request a student meal accommodation. So again, we'll see some examples of that documentation on this next slide. One of them is this accommodation. So you can request a meal accommodation using that meal accommodation form, and that should be completed by the student or the households. And this would be utilized as an example. Maybe Johnny is allergic to strawberries. However, the school food authority or the site would be able to offer a different fruit for that student whenever strawberries are menu. menu. So that meal pattern is still able to be met. So that is where the request for meal accommodation form would be utilized. That's an example of how that would be utilized. For accommodations that would be outside of meal pattern requirements, a request form, this medical statement, would need to be completed by the parent or households along with a medical provider. So that would need to be a licensed healthcare provider that is completing that form. So an example here would be for, let's say, a student that has celiac disease and requires gluten-free items. So a medical statement would be necessary to show that the food service staff knows exactly what needs that student has, but also so that when we're coming in to do a review, there's that documentation to say, oh, hey, the student isn't just getting treated differently because we decided to, but rather there's adequate reason that that student would be getting an alternate meal item and something that would be outside of that meal pattern requirement. So this allows you to still claim those meals for reimbursement, even though it's outside of that meal pattern requirement. I do want to note it is not allowable to ask a student to just not take the grain offering in the instance of like celiac disease. If offer versus serve is implemented, you still need to make appropriate accommodations for that student. And then for lifestyle choices, this is really something that I would suggest you look at on a case-by-case basis and determine how you want to approach that. Obviously, you know, we want to encourage you to consider offering menu options that might allow for those accommodations. If utilizing OVS or offer versus serve, maybe that allows that student to make those choices, but you're not required to make accommodations for lifestyle choices. So oftentimes we hear things like, oh, well, this particular student decided that she's vegetarian one day, but then the next day, you know, she's back to eating beef because hamburger pizza is on the menu and that's one of her favorites. So, you know, again, we understand that you have to make sure that you can align with what these students need, but also make it appropriate for your actual operation. So hopefully that kind of provides some examples on how you would use those special diet forms. And with that, I think I'm going to let Donna take over the rest. Did I get that right, Donna?
Thank you. Good job. Special diets are really important and becoming more so, it seems, all the time. So we're going to talk a little bit about a few topics, wrap up some loose ends here. We're going to start with professional standards. And I know that most of you are familiar with professional standards. Since 2015, annual professional standards continuing ed credit hours have been in effect for all food service staff. And so this requires a minimum number of continuing ed credit hours for both school nutrition program directors and staff each year. And you see here on this slide, the top part of a handout that starts on page 68 of your handout packet. It's a 2-page handout. It shows us, according to the title, how many required hours you have every year of training. Program directors are those people who oversee the operation of any food service operation. So any of you who may, no matter what your title is at the school, if it's manager, staff, if you are the person that oversees the direction of the food service operation, you're considered the director. Now, and you see here that there are differences in the number of hours that you do have to earn. And I apologize for my voice again. Couple of things on this handout that are really important to pay attention to. Training hours earned in excess of the annual requirement may be applied to the school year directly preceding or directly following the date of training. And we've seen a lot of situations over the last couple of years where people, because of the pandemic, were not able to get the amount of training they needed. So they could either take extra hours from the preceding year to make up some of those hours, or, for example, if you did not get the number of training hours you needed in school year 21-22, you can earn extra hours in this school year, and those can be used to make up the difference. So that's kind of helpful. And I just want to remind you, there's a training certificate, number 1 page in your handout packet. And after the webinar, complete the certificate and keep on file. Whenever you complete training, you can keep the certificate that they provide if a certificate is provided for you. But if not, we accept documentation of training, and we have training tracker logs that you can use. So we also included one of those on page 72 of your handout, and these are also available on our webpage. So next slide. Okay, so that's all about the continuing education. The USDA also has professional standards, hiring standards, and this is something that kind of isn't always clear because a lot of people don't really know about this. This means that new school nutrition program directors have certain standards they must meet, education and experience requirements. Now, this is a handout from USDA, and it's also in your packet, beginning on page 70. And this is based on your student enrollment, and basically new food service directors must meet the education experience requirements on this handout on the second page. So if you are new, or if you are maybe someone who knows that there's going to be a new person hired, this is for the nutrition program directors only, these requirements. So be sure and contact our office and we'll help you go through this. New food service directors also must be certified in food safety. And now this is listed both on the USDA handout and the NDE handout that we referred to on the previous slide. So what we're requiring now is that new food service directors have serve safe training, and you must have that not more than 5 years prior to your starting date or within 30 days of your start date. And so on the NDE handout, there are lots of links to training, and that includes the serve safe training. So be sure to keep all of this documentation, all of your training documentation, hiring documentation, because it's very important. This is stuff that we'll be looking at when we go out on reviews, or I should say when the crew goes out on reviews. Okay, next slide. Let's change topics. That was a quickie. Now we're going to go into smart snacks discussion, but we're going to start here with a discussion about non-program foods, because you hear us talk about non-program foods. The definition is any non-reimbursable food or beverage purchase using funds from the nonprofit food service account. Okay, so it's non-reimbursable. The USDA does not reimburse you for this. This includes the sale of second entrees, milk, snacks, and that includes smart snacks and also adult meals. So this includes adult meals basically and a la carte items. Prices charged for these items must be set high enough to recover the food costs, the operating costs. You cannot lose money. You cannot use federal money to make up the difference on non-program foods. There is a calculation form in your handouts on page 73. And this is something that might be useful for you to go through and kind of document some of your items that you might sell for a la carte, and basically make sure that you're paying enough. I know that items like milk, for example, have gone up dramatically in price for some schools. I talked to a food service manager a couple of weeks ago. She said my cost for milk last year was 31 cents per carton. It's gone up 10 cents a carton, and I'm sure some of you have stories like that to tell. So you always have to make sure that you are charging enough to cover your food cost and operating costs. And so that form is something that we will ask you to fill out when we do come out for an administrative review. And the NDE recommended adult meal price, I believe, Sean, can you set me straight, but have we set that for sure, or are we waiting for the calculation from the reimbursement?
Donna, that's such a great question. And I do not know the answer. I know we had tentatively set $2.60 for breakfast and $4.25 for lunch. But now that we have the actual rates, I don't think that will be changing.
Okay, I was about that.
But I'm not 100% for sure.
Well, stay tuned, folks. Right now,
I'm sure our office will be releasing information this week.
yes. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we will make sure that you get that information about adult meal prices, and because the reimbursement rates are out, Katie is really quick about getting to it on things like that. So the main thing here is to remember the food service program cannot financially support the sale of non-program food items and meals, meaning adult meals, non-program adult meals, which means federal dollars cannot be used to support the sale of these items. So next up on the next slide is Nebraska's competitive food policy. So this policy was put into effect to identify when foods can be sold. But what are competitive foods? Competitive to what? They're sold at school during meal times, and they are foods from which the nonprofit school food service account does not receive the proceeds from those sales. So in other words, these foods are being sold in competition with the school meals program. So that means that they cannot be sold at the same time that school lunch and breakfast are being held. Competitive food sales are prohibited from 1/2 hour before meal service until 1/2 hour after meal service. And this applies to both breakfast and lunch. Let's say your school has a vending machine managed by the student council. It has to be turned off during those periods of time. This is something we check again, going out there on those reviews to make sure that no other organization is competing with you as far as selling items. So reimbursement can be withheld from schools in violation of this policy. So that leads us to, now remember, competitive foods say when foods can be sold. The next slide begins our quick little smart snacks conversation here. And smart snacks regulations specify what foods and beverages can be sold during the school day. So yes, there are smart snack standards and guidelines that must be met. If your school does allow foods and beverages to be sold during the day at times other than meal times, this specifies what food and beverages can be sold. Now, a school day is defined as midnight the night before until 30 minutes after the end of the school day. And school campus is defined as all property under the jurisdiction of the school. And we're going to talk about fundraisers in just a minute. Yes, it does include fundraisers. Okay, so if back to the student council vending machine, If they want to turn it on a half hour after breakfast and lunch so they can sell during the day, they can't just sell anything they want. They can't just sell regular pop and candy bars. The items in the machine must meet Smart Snack standards. So that this basically, and that applies also to fundraisers. But let me show you a couple of handouts we have in your packet. This is the handout decision, the Smart Snack decision chart that basically defines the standards for snacks that you see here. And beverages is on the opposite, the other side. I didn't make a slide from the other side of this handout, but you can see that it begins on the left side with meeting all of the nutrition standards for, let's say you have a snack. It can be 200 calories or less, not 201, 202 per serving. Sodium requirements, total fat percentage, saturated fat, trans fat, and total sugar. It has to meet those requirements. Plus, on the right-hand side, it must be the first ingredients whole grain, greater than 50% whole grain. First ingredient is one of the following: fruit, vegetable, dairy, meat. This is where, when we were talking about fruit roll-ups and fruit snacks earlier, I believe there was a little conversation going on about that. And a lot of those do not have fruit as the first ingredient, so they cannot be sold as a smart snack, nor can they be used in the school food service operation. So this is a handy table or chart for you to use and to see if your snack falls within the required limits. And we'll come back, we'll tell you some more ways you can figure that out too. This is the beverage guide. Now, the Smart Snack guide we just looked at was available and pertains to all grade groups. This one with beverages have different recommendations and requirements, I should say, for all different grade groups. So this is a little more complicated. And on one side, it tells you what K through 6 can have, 7 through 8, and 9 through 12, grades 9 through 12. So it tells you the type of product, the size of the product. So it's, again, another good guide. Now, we understand that, again, with the vending machines, oftentimes you don't have, the school food service doesn't have anything to do with them. It might be the student council, it might be an athletic organization, or just some other organization in the school. So you may not really have a lot to do with this. If you do, then you have the guidance that you need to help you determine if you're selling the proper items. And if not, then when we do a review, we talk to the individuals in charge of monitoring things like the vending machines. So as far as fundraising, yes, for fundraisers from the midnight until half an hour after school is out, there can be no fundraisers in the school selling cookies, candy, things that don't meet Smart Snack standards. There can be items sold that meet Smart Snack standards, and that has to be, again, approved. But basically, we see fundraisers now, most of the time, it's things like frozen cookie dough, frozen pizza, and they're delivered after school hours generally. And besides that, even if you carried a tub of frozen cookie dough around all day, I'm thinking that you probably couldn't eat it. I mean, I know a lot of you like frozen cookie dough. I'm not a big fan, but that's something that wouldn't happen. So most fundraisers are basically after hours. Okay, next slide, just a slide that shows us Alliance for Healthier Generation. It's a website where you can find a product calculator to find out if your product meets Smart Snack standards, and you don't have to go through all the math and do all of that yourself. You can go to this website, and this website is linked to our Smart Snacks webpage, so you can easily access it. Plug in the information it asks for, and it will tell you if it's Smart Snack compliant. All right. I love this topic, procurement. Sean, are you sure you don't want to talk about this?
Oh, Donna, I can if you'd like.
No, I'll go ahead, but I appreciate your willingness to jump in. Okay, so procurement basically is purchasing, right? Instead of saying purchasing, they give it another term. And it's simply the act of obtaining goods and services in exchange for money. The procurement is a multi-step systematic approach to acquiring goods, supplies, and services at the best prices. You're using federal dollars here to buy things, so you want the most bang for your buck. You're required to use free and open competition when making purchases. And this means that all vendors have the same opportunity to compete for your business. So we at Nutrition Services, I think that Sean has mentioned, we're now required to conduct a procurement review every 3 to 6 years. We will ask to review your procurement plan. We have a template in your handouts, code of ethics, and we will review purchasing documentation. And we definitely are very clear about what we require for that. So procurement reviews are usually conducted at the same time as an administrative review. And again, you must have your code of conduct, your procurement plan, both of those, there are templates for both in the handout packet, and purchasing documentation kept on file. Your invoices and keeping documentation on how you compare prices, everything that relates to your purchasing, you should be keeping that on file. And I know the bookkeepers keep invoices on file, most likely for you also. So in your handout, we have this procurement tree, I guess you could call it, or chart, flow chart. And after you determine what products and services you will need for the year, you will need to determine which procurement method to use, because there are a few different methods here. There's informal, formal, as you see on this slide. Informal includes things called micro purchases for purchases under 10,000, small purchases that basically, if you need to be aware of your local small purchase threshold, if you do not have one, if the SFA does not have one, the state and federal threshold can be used. And as you see on this slide, it's $250,000. When the value of the purchase is estimated to be less or equal to $250,000, informal methods, including micro purchase and small purchase, may be followed. And the thing about micro purchases, it sounds really easy. Oh, distribute equitably among suppliers. That's the whole thing. A lot of people use this when we're talking farm to school purchasing, but you can't just keep going back to the same person all the time. You have to share the wealth and distribute the purchasing equitably among all qualified suppliers that you have access to. And the price must be reasonable, but price comparisons are not required with micro purchasing. Small purchases, on the other hand, under $250,000, require you to obtain 3 price quotes, and you should keep your documentation of the price comparisons on file at the school, as I mentioned earlier. You may also use this method for purchases under $10,000 also, and that you compare prices for. If you made purchases greater than $250,000, now we have just a handful of schools in Nebraska that may do that. The formal procedures include getting sealed bids and competitive proposals, and those 2 items must be used. So next slide is Buy American. Of course, all food procurement transactions using funds from the nonprofit food service account must comply with the Buy American provision. Now, there are some exceptions. I mean, you don't see many banana trees in Nebraska, I don't believe, or anywhere else in the US. So if the product is not produced or manufactured in the US, insufficient or unreasonable quantities of a satisfactory quality, or competitive bids reveal the cost of the U.S. product is significantly higher than the non-domestic product, then you can possibly buy a product that is not born and raised in the United States. I'm trying to find the procurement Buy American provision is page 85 in your handout. And then there's a Buy American justification form that you should complete when purchasing a non-domestic food product due to the following exceptions, such as we said, availability and cost. Those are the two things. Is it available, and is the cost significantly higher? And definitely that is something, part of the documentation you must keep on hand for procurement. Okay, a couple of slides here about supply chain assistance funding, otherwise known as SCA, another acronym. This funding was distributed to SFAs last school year, 21-22, and they can be used only for unprocessed or minimally processed food items. I know some of you still have some of those funds that you will be using, because I believe the deadline is somewhat in the future. Maintain your receipts. Be sure, again, here you go, folks, documentation and invoices for review and audit purposes. Be sure to follow the Buy American provision, and there will be reallocation of unclaimed funds in school year 22-23, which is great news. But next slide, please. The Biden administration announced on June 30th, which was about a month ago, that additional funding to schools to support the purchase of American grown foods for school meal programs was approved, and that will be coming this year sometime. You'll be able to apply for another round of supply chain assistance funds. So take advantage of this if at all possible, because it's a very good deal. All right, I believe this is our last content slide before we get to questions. The USDA Foods program. The information on the right side of your screen is the handout in your handout packet. And what it tells us is who to contact when you have a commodity question. If you're a new food service director, you need to know how to set up an account. Basically, you can contact Chad or Brian. Either one of them are very helpful to help you figure out what's going on. And this is the USDA Foods program, or otherwise known as commodities, is administered by DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services. It's not administered by us or the Department of Ed. And basically it means that you get entitlement dollars for the purchase of domestic agricultural food products in schools and institutions. And you need to use those dollars annually. But you know what? I am not a person to ask how to use those dollars. So I know we don't feel like we're the people who should be talking to you about this, even though some of my coworkers are much smarter about this than I am. But so that's why we give you Chad and Brian to contact. All righty. So here we are wrapping it up for a great school year. Remember, now this is a time to ask questions and to maybe answer some questions that have not yet been answered. But remember that if you are operating an after-school care snack program or special milk program, stick around.
So with that in mind, Taylor, if you will go to the next slide, please. We have, excuse me, 2 slides. We have just a couple of slides revolving around the after school care snack program and the special milk program. So next slide, I'm going to try to catch up to where I need to be here. Okay, so For the after school care snack program, there's again similar things that we need to keep in mind. For instance, operators must complete production records and also obtain accurate point of service meal counts to support that claim for reimbursement. We recognize that oftentimes this program might be operated or administered by another individual, maybe somebody from family service or an after-school care program, but it's your job to communicate with those individuals to make sure that these requirements are met. Typically, there's an educational or an enrichment type activity offered alongside of this program, or as a part of this program rather. One thing that you should be aware of is that 2 on-site reviews would be required each school year. And the first of those 2 reviews should be conducted within the first 4 weeks of program start date. So that would be, again, falling to, that responsibility would fall to the food service director. Obviously, again, making sure that food safety is of the utmost importance, making sure that any training that staff would need for that, again, since it may be different staff members that aren't maybe in your school meals operation, making sure that they have adequate training revolving around food safety, and then also ensuring that water is available for students during this program. So on the next slide, we see how some of these components, or what would be required in terms of the components. At least 2 different components would be required to be offered or served, excuse me. You cannot do offer versus serve in this program. 2 different components in the required portion size would be required. So that could be 1 cup of milk, 1 ounce of meat or meat alternate, 1 ounce equivalent of grains, or 3/4 of a cup of 100% juice or fruit or vegetable. So again, note the serving size or the portion size for the fruit and vegetable component. That is 3/4 of a cup. And then also note that juice and milk cannot be served together as the 2 components. So if you're serving milk and you want to serve juice with that, another component would also need to be offered or served in order to meet the requirements of the program. I keep saying offered, but that is a mistake because, as I said earlier, offer versus serve is not allowable within this after-school snack program. So that means that students must take both of the food components that are served. I almost said offered it there again. And then again, making sure that documentation is retained. So those production records showing how those food components credit, the portion sizes, and the amount of food needed for the number of snacks that are planned. And there are, the production record for this program is included in your handout packet, but you could also find additional resources at our website at the link that is posted on the bottom of this slide. All right, moving on to special milk. So special milk program is only available for students who would otherwise not have access to meals such as breakfast or lunch. So commonly we might see this for like half-day preschool students, or in some instances, some summer camps will operate the special milk program. Then they don't offer any additional meal options. 1% or skim unflavored milk is the only varieties that are allowed to be offered. So again, unflavored, flavored milk cannot be offered in this program. It would need to be operated on a nonprofit basis. And there's 2 program options for participation. You could either choose to charge all households and claim as paid milk, or you could utilize eligibility documentation and claim those milks as paid and free milk. So on the next slide, we see how you would, how that would arise in your actual claim in CNP. So if you are, as you're submitting a claim for reimbursement, if you're determining free eligibility, you would list the number of free milk served and the number of paid milk served. If you are charging households, then you would just submit that claim based on the number of paid milk served. And then obviously you would also input the average cost per half pint. So keep in mind that is the actual price of the milk. Maybe that's going to be different from what you charge for extra milk. So make sure that you are recovering those costs. And then on line C of the claim, that total milk reimbursable would auto-populate as part of the claim. So again, two different ways to go about that. You could charge all households or determine who will pay for the milk. You must use a non-program funding source. So maybe the general fund wants to offset this program and they want to provide the milk so that they're not charging households. But again, it cannot come out of the nonprofit food service account. And then here also documentation is necessary. So you want to ensure that a point of service meal count is able to be obtained. And then obviously you would submit your claim for reimbursement alongside your other school meals program claims. So that would only, and somebody else from our office can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe you would only see this special milk program claim for reimbursement if you click that program in your actual application. Otherwise, it would not show up on your claim for reimbursement. So I believe that is the end of those. So they're kind of quick and easy overviews, but if you have questions on those programs, again, we're happy to entertain those questions and talk through any additional questions that may have gone unanswered previously.
Just a lot of thank yous from you, but I think the thank yous back at you for all your time and attention today. You know how to reach us. Our contact information is on the front page of the website. There is a directory that you can print or view, and it has our phone numbers and our emails. And we just look forward to just a great school year, that we don't have too many hiccups that happen this year. So with that being said, I think we're ready to end the meeting.